In this episode, we've got puppy love, supportive friends, emotional growth, and pretty flowers. Let's get recapping. After winter break, it's announced that Tsubomi will be leaving Salt Middle School. Mob is in distress as his timeline to ask her out has decreased. On short notice, he seeks the advice of his school friends. Regardless of everyone's varying competency in dating advice, they are at least supportive. That is until he runs into Misato, who is far more inquisitive, questioning if Tsubomi really likes anyone and why Mob even desires her, which is something he struggles to put into words. Reigen persuades Mob that it really only matters that he feels strongly about it. When Mob pushes for more specific advice on how he should go about asking her out, Reigen is forced to pull from cookie-cutter advice he finds online. Although he stresses for Mob to speak from the heart, letting Mob know a game plan doesn't matter as long as he's honest with her. Once Mob has left, Reigen reveals his own dating insecurities, believing he would have likely used a facade to impress a woman. He is proud that his student is not in the same position. Meanwhile, Mob runs into Teru, with whom he shares his self-doubt, stating he's not popular like him. Teru retorts that it was Mob who once said they were both alike.
We're the same. From my perspective, you're just an average person.
He urges Mob to be more confident, and perhaps bring a gift, like flowers. Later on, Ritsu confronts Mob, recalling the time when he overheard Tsubomi say she was already interested in someone else. We learn later on in that episode it was actually a lie she told to see how Reigen would react.
Truth is, I just made that whole story up. I didn't want you to get scammed or something, so I thought I'd throw him a curveball and test him a bit.
Ritsu can't bring himself to speak about it, so he lets Mob know to remain strong-willed regardless of what she says. Mob finally builds up the courage to call Tsubomi, both agreeing to meet at the park they used to play at. The next day, his schoolmates are impressed with him. Mob now has a newfound confidence, reflecting that he had been worrying too much. As well, he hasn't had to hold back his emotions as much lately. While picking up flowers for Tsubomi, he crosses paths with Minagishi, who offers Mob a more exquisite bouquet. On his way to the park, Mob sees a boy cross the street who is nearly struck by a careless driver. Mob is able to push the boy out of the way, but he ends up being hit himself. Oh boy, Mob has a lot of introspection to deal with this episode, starting off by realizing that he hasn't made any progress towards confessing to Tsubomi. The hesitancy is understandable for the average boy his age. I thought it was interesting that he was challenged on the reasons why he likes Tsubomi, and comes short on an intelligible response. Now, this may appear to be targeting some shallowness in Mob's infatuation, but the later scenes balance it out by pointing out it shouldn't matter if he can't express himself clearly. The show makes a point of replaying this flashback while Mob is mulling it over.
Look! I'm only showing you these things, Tsubomi!
I'm getting bored.
The implication may be this was the first time anyone challenged Mob's perception of himself and his powers. We know it had a profound impact on him. It's part of the reason he joins the Body Improvement Club. We can see an echo of Tsubomi's indifference in most of Mob's confrontations.
If you take away your abilities, there'll be nothing left. You'll be empty. No friends. Just another loser who won't leave a mark in this world.
So her influence on Mob is felt throughout the show despite her lack of screen time. I believe Mob has an appreciation for this whether he knows it or not. But also I agree with Reigen, most kids aren't thinking that deeply, and relationships can develop the more you get to know someone. Also, some neat touches. Mob continues to show his physical growth, actually being able to participate in sports. He also declines Teru's fashion advice, which was a funny reminder. The last thing to mention about Mob, the day after he had worked up the nerve to make plans with Tsubomi, he basically announces that we're at the endgame.
Lately, I've started noticing I don't hold back my feelings as much.
Mob holding back his emotions is the premise of the show, and we'll see how that factors into the rest of the arc. Moving on to our supporting characters, the poor Body Improvement Club. They are so out of their league when Mob seeks help from them, as they've really only had one approach to anything ever.
Fight! Let's go!
and you can tell how much it strains them to think of advice. However, it's admirable that they try to lift his spirits despite not having the answers needed. The Telepath Club guys probably had my favorite reaction. They're just as helpless, but rooting for him. Misato did give some advice.
Be dependable, listen to her problems, and show her she can talk to you about anything.
Though her most interesting lines were about who Tsubomi may like and why Mob likes her. That may come across as combative, but in a later scene she's cheering him on as Mob's finally going through with asking Tsubomi out. These scenes might seem to contradict, however, I think this is easily reconciled. It's always been in her personality to ask invasive questions, and why she has an interest in journalism. It's also not the first time she's been perplexed by the popularity of Tsubomi. There might be a hint of jealousy, but I'm not firm enough on that argument. Minagishi once again gets a brief scene, albeit this time more dignified than falling unconscious in an alleyway. He hands over an extravagant bouquet to Mob. This gesture carries more weight beyond a kind act. If you recall, Mob did convince Mogami not to slaughter Minagishi, so from his point of view, this is probably the least he can do. Reigen again gets some subtle character work. He had alluded that he wouldn't have much of a chance romantically, conceding he felt he would need to hide his true self. Likely he's vicariously hoping Mob will succeed where he would fail. I think this plays well with Reigen's insecurities throughout the season so far. The time he noticed Mob didn't need his help, no plans with anyone on New Year's Eve, and now his romantic uncertainties. I think most understand the sting of rejection regardless of the context, but Tsubomi's position isn't one I'm envious of either. In fact, I feel worse for her, having to reject these absurd number of guys, some of who she's never even met before. To her credit, she pretty much handles these guys as Dimple described, clearly having no problems speaking her mind. Misato theorizes that Tsubomi may keep her feelings concealed from boys who only like her for her looks, but I would also add her friends to that, as these visuals imply. And we can include the scene where she felt too embarrassed to ask them for a tissue. I think the biggest takeaway of Misato's description of Tsubomi shielding her emotions also mirrors Mob's issues. The last thing to address is the car collision. I thought that timing was a little silly that Mob just happens to save 2 lives within a minute. Nonetheless, it shows that Mob needed to slow down the vehicle and didn't instantly stop the car. I imagine it would have likely resulted in the driver's death had he done so. Now this is important for the decision he makes later to jump in front of the car and push the boy out of the way instead of using his powers. As decent of a setup as it is, it left me conflicted. I'm pretty certain there have been instances of Espers yanking people out of the way in an instant. Then again, as a counter, Mob didn't have the time to process the best possible decision to make at that moment. Proceeding with Mob's lifeless body, I recall seeing a discussion thread touch upon or at least mention plot armor. Now that may seem absurd considering the amount of damage that we've seen Espers take. This leads me into speaking about barriers and the issues I've had with them since Season 1. Espers, in particular Mob, takes some hits that get a huge reaction out of him. Some of these strikes are connecting despite the barrier. They do break through. For whatever reason, this child is taking punishment from adults without getting knocked unconscious. This may be recency bias, but I think the best display of how a barrier should work is Mob's fight with Dimple, where his reactions are not nearly as brutal while being pummeled because, ostensibly, the barrier is doing its job. The only time Mob takes a bad hit, he seems to get singed, and he becomes more serious and ready to end the fight, obviously because he feels his life is in danger at that moment. Although, anytime a character starts puking up large portions of blood, I think the fight must be over, but they just continue on like it never happened. It might make you think that Espers are supernaturally durable. However, we've seen Shimazaki get within Teru's barrier and knock him out with a single punch. Unfortunately, some dire inconsistencies on just how much damage characters can take in this world. So it leads me to conclude that characters are going to take however much punishment the story requires. Amazing use of the supporting cast and their interactions with Mob in this episode, as well as tying everything back to where Mob started and directly comparing it with where he currently is. Despite my criticisms of the ending, I'm still looking forward to the consequences of this episode and the conclusion of the series as a whole. That's all for now.